Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our 23rd Annual Jewish Book Festival, sponsored by the Jewish Federation of the San Gabriel and Pomona Valleys. We're so happy you're able to join us tonight. My name is Denise Schaefer, and I'm one of the members of the organizing committee and your moderator for this evening. On a personal note, this is my first year, and I've been amazed at all the effort and commitment it takes to create a festival of this size. So before we start our program, I'd like to acknowledge all the people involved. A thank you to our hardworking committee members and our first-time chair this year, Linda Mazer, our advanced readers, the Federation staff and our coordinator, Kim Banaji, the Jewish Book Council in New York, our behind-the-scenes tech wizard, Jake Tavel, and our literary circle members. Your financial support makes the entire festival possible. Thank you all. For this evening's program, our author will speak first about his book, and then you'll be able to ask questions after his presentation. To do so, just go to the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen and type them in at any time. After the questions, we have a surprise for you, which we know you'll enjoy. So now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's guest author. Mitchell James Kaplan is the award-winning historical novelist of two previous novels, By Fire by Water and Into the Unbound Night. Rhapsody, his fascinating third novel, is set in the 1920s and 30s jazz age of New York City during a period of sweeping social and cultural change. This is both a love story of two musical giants, Catherine K. Swift and George Gershwin, and a glimpse into their influence on popular music history. Mitchell James Kaplan is a graduate of Yale and has lived in both Paris and Los Angeles. In addition to researching and crafting historical novels, he also plays classical and jazz flute. He's coming to us tonight from Roanoke, Virginia. Mitchell, we are very excited to have you join us and share your insights into your latest novel, Rhapsody.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Denise. I believe you can all hear me and see me. If not, you'll let me know. So I wanted to, what I wanted to do this evening briefly is to tell you a little bit about what I was thinking about, some of the thoughts that were going through my mind as I wrote Rhapsody. And I don't have a copy of it here to show you, unfortunately. But anyway, rather than tell you the story, I just wanted to kind of introduce you to some of the thinking that informed the book behind the scenes in my mind. And in particular, what I want to talk about, because this was a big concern of mine that I was really thinking about throughout the process, is music and identity. And I was thinking through these questions as I wrote the novel. And in a way, the novel is an exploration for me, in part. It's an exploration of a lot of things, but in part of these questions of music and identity. I think our identities are really a sort of collage. For example, you have multiple identities, American, Jewish, whatever. And they're like circles that overlap. And where all those circles overlap, including identities that you've inherited from the past and identities that are rooted in the present, where all those circles interact, that's you, where they overlap. And I think that the common area that's occupied by a great number of these circles, but not all of them, is called a culture. So I want to talk a little bit about, as I say, identity and music and culture. Catherine Swift, who's the main character in my book Rhapsody, grew up listening to classical music and loved it. Her father was an opera critic. And classical music, as you know, was the music of wealthy, educated Europeans. But there's another kind of music in Europe, and that was folk music. Classical music tended to be kind of global within Europe. It belonged to the aristocratic class, which covered all of Europe. Folk musics were separate and local. So you had Irish music, which you know the sound of, probably it's played fast. You've got klezmer music in the Jewish shtetls. You've got various folk music in different parts of Europe, and they sound very different from each other. Um, and I think that music arises out of a given subculture and serves as a cultural glue for the people that participate in that subculture. So if you're listening to classical music in Europe in the 19th century, you either belong to the aristocracy or you aspire to that culture. If you listen to klezmer music, obviously um, it that music helps to create a sense of community between you and the other people who listen to and enjoy that music in bar mitzvahs and weddings and other events. Um, so if you step back from this tableau that I've been painting of Europe coming into the 20th century, we're talking about, when we talk about classical music and various folk musics, we're also talking about socioeconomic groups. Aristocrats tended to be wealthy and mobile, and their music came to symbolize wealth and privilege, and to use today's jargon, global identity. People who came from one regional folk music, who enjoyed one regional folk music or another, tended to be less wealthy, and their music came to symbolize the aspirations and the courage of their less privileged groups. That's the kind of musical, cultural background when we come to the end of the 19th century, and then soon thereafter, Europe destroys itself in World War I. And suddenly, America is the most powerful country in the world. And America is filled with immigrants from the lower classes in Europe, as well as Africans, who by the end of the 19th century had been released from bondage throughout the United States. And all these people, all these different peoples, Italians, Irish, Germans, Africans, had brought their folk music traditions with them and modified them, and also developed new folk traditions on American soil. Um, Not many of the immigrants who came to America came from the aristocratic or the bourgeois, the upper classes in Europe, just below the aristocrats in terms of the socioeconomic hierarchy. The aristocrats and the bourgeoisie still occupied a coveted place in European society. Why would they leave Europe? But there was a tiny, you might say, subculture within a subculture of the European upper class that remained uncomfortable in Europe. And I'm talking about some of the small number of Jews who had accumulated great wealth in Europe. No matter how much classical music they listened to, how many beautiful homes they owned in Hamburg or Paris, how many great works of art adorned their walls, anti-Semitism was still a very powerful force in Europe. So some of them decided to relocate to America. And among these families were branches of the Warburg families, the Seligmans, the Schiffs, and they built their homes on Fifth Avenue near those of the Vanderbilts and the Fricks. And though they still had to deal with social ostracism, it was nothing like Europe. This is the milieu from which one of the main characters of Rhapsody, Jimmy Warburg, comes. Um, Jimmy immigrated to America as a young child, grew up listening to classical music, went to Harvard. His father was an advisor to President Woodrow Wilson. His father, Paul Warburg, helped to create the Federal Reserve Bank. So when Jimmy meets this brilliant young classical pianist, Catherine Swift, they find out that not only do they share a passion for the music of European high culture, but they each have something to offer the other. Jimmy has wealth, Catherine has gentility, and gentility is seen by many in Jimmy's world as a passport into American high society. With America's new standing after World War I as the cultural, as the economic and military power, leading power in the world, everyone looked to America to be the cultural power of the world. And Jimmy and Catherine, Jimmy Warburg, who soon marries Catherine Swift, they find themselves in a position to help fashion the music and poetry that will represent America to the world. And they are very conscious of the role they should play, which they feel as an obligation as well as a privilege. Excuse me. But there's a problem. They both come from the tradition of European high culture. And in fact, they know really nothing else. This tradition, particularly its music, is central to their identity. They don't yet have the tools that are required to forge a new, uniquely American culture. Now, I want to say that in America, all kinds of folk music traditions have been mixing together and affecting each other. And I'd like to add that there is no pure folk tradition in music in America. They all influence each other. For example, blues harmonies, which we associate with Black music in America, the blues harmonies actually come from European minor mode scales. There's no precedent for them in Africa. And the blues instruments, guitar and harmonica, also come from Europe. And the music that people associate with white people in the South, country music, is deeply influenced by the blues. Which also preserves rhythms that do come from Africa. So, and that very much are going to end up affecting the development of jazz. So in America, the identities are much less distinct and more fluid than in Europe, where Ireland, for example, is so culturally remote from, say, Kiev. And I make this point not to be provocative, but because it is profoundly relevant to the music that's going to arise in New York and elsewhere in the first decades of the 20th century, and that's going to define American culture for much of the world going forward from that point. One of the most exciting cultural developments in America during this period that we're talking about, after World War I, before World War II, is the direct result of the great migration of African Americans into the northern industrial cities. So we've got Fats Waller, Jelly Roll, Morton, Ragtime, Stride, Boogie Woogie, these various strands of music that African Americans in the big cities in the North and in the South are becoming great innovators and very, very proficient at. Today, we see these forms of music as jazz, or as the forerunners of jazz. The great, great inventors of these styles, one of the greatest is Scott Joplin, who invents this style called ragtime. He was a highly educated musician. He wrote out his music, and it wasn't jazz. It didn't involve improvisation, but it had these syncopated, it incorporated these syncopated styles that would become very much intrinsic to jazz. And he influenced these other players that I mentioned, Louis Armstrong, Fats Waller, Jelly Roll Morton, who are developing stride style and Dixieland jazz. And it's a whole new sonic territory that's exploding in American culture. At the same time, you've got this other explosion that's simultaneous, which is Broadway shows. So Broadway shows were an adaptation in America of the European tradition of light opera. The great European composers of light opera included Offenbach, Johann Strauss, and of course the great, brilliant team of Gilbert and Sullivan. Light opera was not folk music, and it was not exactly classical music either. Unlike folk music, it was written down by highly trained musicians, and it was performed on traditional instruments, orchestra instruments. But while the operas of Puccini and Richard Strauss tended to treat tragic subjects, the purpose of light opera was to make its audience smile and laugh. And the spin-off from light opera that developed in America, which we call musical theater, started out or developed out of burlesque shows and vaudeville, which which blended stories and music in loosely structured performances that had happy endings on the stages of Broadway. Now I'd like to tell you a little bit about George Gershwin, since he's the third leg of the love triangle that also includes Catherine Swift, whom I mentioned, and Jimmy Warburg, whom I mentioned. When it comes to music, George Gershwin is a human sponge. He taught himself to play piano on the player piano at the home of a friend as a kid. And what he learned was this music, Scott Joplin. There were Scott Joplin piano rolls, and he fit his fingers into the player piano keys and learned to play Scott Joplin without any teacher, without his parents even being aware of it. And so he picked up these jaunty, syncopated rhythms. And at the same time, actually a little bit later, when his family moved around Brooklyn, the Lower East Side, Harlem. They lived in Harlem for a while. George started to actually study stride and boogie woogie with some of the early African American players of those musical forms before any white people even knew about them up in Harlem. And so he learned he learned blues, boogie woogie, stride from these great African American musicians. And and his parents, when they found out that he could play piano proficiently, they got him a classical teacher, and he started taking classical piano lessons. So George absorbed all of these styles. Um, and the reason his parents wanted him to take classical lessons, as I should mention as a kind of a side note, is that they were Jewish immigrants, and they wanted to assimilate, and they wanted their kid to be able to penetrate into the upper reaches of American culture, which they associate with classical music because it came from Europe, because it symbolized that in Europe, because they were from Europe, because that was where the culture was at that time. So George drops out of school at 16, starts playing piano for a living in Tin Pan Alley, which is a part of New York City where musicians are hired to demonstrate the new songs for performers. And it's there that he meets Fred and Adele Astaire. They're kids. He's 16. They're actually 14 when they come dancing into his office in Tin Pan Alley. And he is demonstrating for them the newest songs that they're hoping to be performing on stages in New York City. And he and Fred Astaire and Adele Astaire become close friends, and they remain friends for the rest of very tight friends for the rest of George's life. Of course, all of these people have just immense talent. George becomes proficient in Broadway music. That's his job now, is to sell Broadway music, to introduce performers to the newest songs. Remember, we don't have record players or MP3 files or anything like that at this time. It's the very beginning of the Victrola, but it's not used for this purpose. So you've got sheet music mostly, and you've got players, and and the performers come to these offices on Tin Pan Alley to hear people like George Gershwin playing the newest tunes. So what happens? George Gershwin writes some tunes of his own. He becomes a hit on Broadway. Al Jolson sings his first hit song, which is called Swanee, in blackface on the stage of Carnegie Hall. It becomes a huge hit in 1919, and George Gershwin starts becoming very, very famous and wealthy. Um, and by the way, I'd like to, as a side note, also mention that when Al Jolson sings Swanee in blackface, and when George Gershwin writes the music to that song, it's a song, they see it as a song about the suffering of an African American who has come to the big city in the north and misses his home in the south. And Swanee, Swanee, I'm coming back to Swanee. I love the old folks back home. It's not meant as mockery. Blackface often was used for the purpose of mockery. If you go and listen on YouTube to a performance and watch a performance of Al Jolson singing Swanee, you'll see, I think, that it's done with an attitude of sincerity and compassion. There was a tremendous amount um, of feeling on the part of Jews in New York City at that time for the suffering of African American slaves in America. And if you watch Gershwin's opera Porgy and Bess at the Metropolitan in New York City this fall, you'll hear a lot of references to the promised land. George Gershwin was really obsessed with the subject. He saw the Black experience of slavery and liberation as a modern analogy for Jewish experience in ancient Egypt. And when he was later criticized, when Al Jolson and he were both criticized for having uh, for the fact that Swanee was performed in blackface, he took the criticism seriously, and he wrote in his will that Porgy and Bess was never to be performed in blackface, but only by an all African American cast. Um, so I've made that point, and I'll move on now. George, now I'm jumping ahead here to the end because I think my time is pretty much uh, coming up here for this part of our evening. Um, I mentioned that Catherine Swift and Jimmy Warburg yearned to participate in the development of an identifiable American culture. She as a composer and he as a poet. Jimmy Warburg, although he was born into a banking family and went in and took up that role professionally, he very much saw himself as a poet, studied poetry at Harvard, loved poetry. They did finally manage to very much participate in the development of this American culture, and it happened after they became close friends with George Gershwin. In fact, after their friendship evolved into a love triangle, they ended up writing a musical called Fine and Dandy, uh, with music by Catherine, who now called herself Kay Swift, and lyrics by Jimmy under the pseudonym Paul James, and it became a big hit on Broadway, um, and a major achievement in cultural history, in part because it was the first time that a woman had composed the score of a produced Broadway musical. And by the way, the influence was mutual. Kay worked closely with George Gershwin while he wrote Porgy and Bess, which he regarded as his great achievement. His greatest achievement. And although she always denied after he died that she participated in the composition of Porgy and Bess, it's pretty much impossible that her sophisticated knowledge of European classical music and orchestration, she had studied all that at the school that today is known as Juilliard. It was called the Institute of Musical Arts at the time. That all of that was not helpful to Gershwin and an influence on Gershwin. So there was a lot of, in that relationship, there was even in that little world of George Gershwin and Kay Swift and Jimmy Warburg, there was a tremendous amount of cultural influence going on there as well. Um, I think I've pretty much used up my time for talking. I hope that wasn't a mess. It's the first time I've spoken about this book in this format. Um, so that's what I have to say for the moment. Was it clear, Denise?
Yeah. Uh, Yes, thank you. Actually, having read the book and hearing the history and the context of music, and how it evolved was actually very helpful. So I actually have a couple questions to get us started here. Um, I can visualize the romance and the strong connection of Kay and George throughout the book. Can you talk to us a little bit about how each of them worked together and enhanced their own journey and their own music?
How they work together and how that enhanced. Yes, I mean,
Their
I
own
did.
music. So Kay being more classical,
Yeah,
George being more modern and
yeah.
cutting
Well, I
edge.
did.
How did they enhance? Yes.
Well, I mean, I did try to touch on that a little bit in my discussion. That I was talking about music and identity, and I was trying to talk about music as and culture as identity. Um, but I would say they very much were striving, all three of them. Let's just say Kay and George, to find this synthesis, to create this synthesis of all of these traditions that would blend together to create an American culture in music. And uh, I think it was that passion informed their romance and animated their romance. And if I say that my identity is this portion, this overlapping of cultures, you know, as I said, Jewish culture, American culture, all kinds of historical cultural influences, and where they all meet, that little circle is my identity. Um, and 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 another person is similarly a blend of cultures. If you look at America as a place where cultures blend, which was totally what was going on at that time. Everyone saw America as a melting pot, as a place where cultures blend, where we're creating something new out of a bunch of traditions from Europe, from Africa, from Asia, even at that time. I would say you can see that and you can hear that in the music that comes out of the romance between Kay and George Gershwin, that blending of cultures. So what I'm saying is falling in love is a blending of identities, which represents a blending of cultures, in my view.
Great.
Long answer, short question.
Thank you. Why did you choose to put this story in the form of a novel as opposed to a narrative nonfiction?
Well, and that's what I've done for all three of the books that I've written and have been published. Um, I feel that, first of all, narrative nonfiction generally pertains to books that are set in today's world. Although there are some historians who kind of tend in that direction. But when you can't have access to people and interview them, and you can't write dialogue that is based on recordings, you know, and so forth, um, it's very, very difficult to write narrative nonfiction. Now, when you talk about history, straight history, I feel it's very limiting because straight history um, is a description of what happens based on the evidence that we have and strictly based only on the evidence we have. So it's purely objective. You can't get inside people's head when you're writing a history book. A narrative nonfiction is a blend of kind of narrative, which is fiction, and nonfiction, which is history. But as I say, narrative nonfiction, people don't really try to do that with the past. It's kind of impossible. So I feel that the essence of history, the essence of human experience is our experience of the world, it's subjective. History is made of individuals experiencing the times in which they live and interacting with each other in those subjective realms. And objective events also are part of it. So in a novel, you can bring all of that into play. Whereas in a book of history, you can't really get in behind the objective, the exterior of people. As I say, I feel that what matters is the human experience of history. So I have to write my books as novels, but
Mhm.
I do want to base them very much on real events, real people, and try to live what these people experienced as much as possible with the
Great.
help of my imagination and also a lot of research.
Well, there's an amazing amount of authentic detail, and your language is very visual. Of just there's a number of characters and famous icons and names that pop up during the time, politics, the dress. Um, you mentioned you do a lot of in-depth research. Can you tell us about your process? Do you outline the story first? Or do the characters help direct you?
Yeah.
And how long did the book take for you to
Well, actually, if I can go back to my experience with my first book, my second book, and then Rhapsody, and then the book I'm writing now, I would like to say that each of them is a different process. That's what I've learned, is that I don't have a process that translates from one book to the next. It's reinventing the wheel each time. So I do write outlines and then I don't look at them. And then I write more outlines and then I don't look at them. I'm constantly reading, going to museums, visiting people, visiting places in Europe and the Middle East and wherever my books take me and other places as well. Um, Kind of absorbing everything I can about the way people talked and thought and walked and interacted. It's very different in 15th century Spain, which is the setting of my first novel, than in 1920s New York, or first century Rome and Judea and Britannia, which is the setting of my second novel, Into the Unbounded Night. So these are different worlds. People think and act and talk and interact in different ways. Um, I just love the exploration of it. I love it. That's just the most fun thing for me is just diving into these worlds. And really, when I'm writing a novel, I live in these worlds completely. Um, um, as far as Rhapsody in particular goes, that one I sold it before I wrote it. So I was told I had a year to write it, and I gave my publisher a finished draft 1 year after after I mean exactly on my deadline date. Um, and then I had another year to revise it, and I did that. So it took 2 years, the entire process for Rhapsody. My first two novels took 6 years each. And the novel I'm writing now, I've spent a couple of years on it already, and it's a totally different experience. That's all I can say. But it's this one, I feel like I'm wrestling with an angel here.
what is your next book about? Or are you
Oh,
too
okay.
early in the process?
Well, I will say, I want to go back and just answer another thing you just asked, which is, do the characters lead me? And that's an important point. Yes, the characters take over. And really, it gets to a point where you feel like uh, they come alive and you go with them. Once you've got all the history and all the settings and you kind of understand more or less what the territory is that you're exploring, um, then the characters come and they inhabit it and they have their stories to tell. I mean, you have
Mhm.
to know the characters already. You have to know their biographies, and that's why I love writing these historical novels because I really believe in writing a novel is like painting a picture of some of the real world. I'm not interested that much in writing in the sense of abstract expressionism or something. I love the idea of painting a picture that includes these figures, these moving figures, these people with their experiences. I love the idea of being focused on them and leaving myself behind as much as possible. But that said, um, my new novel is set in the mostly in today's world. It kind of goes back and forth between 1967 and 2019, and it's basically the story of a man who lost his older brother whom he adored, who was a casualty of, let's just say, the Cultural Revolution of the late 60s. And that actually happened to me. I did lose my brother in the late 60s. And this person in 2019, he's having to kind of confront ghosts, and he's traveling around the world for his job, which I do, and he meets a young man on a plane with his mother. Uh, the woman is from India, and her son, he becomes persuaded pretty much that this boy is the reincarnation of the brother that he lost. And this woman is Hindu, and it's a love story involving him and her and everything that happens, which I'm not going to tell you about right now, and then his growing persuasion that this boy is the reincarnation of the brother that he lost. So that's just a tiny little hint of what it is. And it's still this big unformed mass that it's like it's out there, and I'm trying to chisel out the stuff that doesn't belong and find the sculpture there. That's how I feel about a novel. It's out there. I've just got to find it and reveal it.
Great, thank you. I just wanted to ask you one last question about music being such a major character. And it's obviously a big part of your life as well, being a jazz flutist. Can you tell us how that came to be and the influences of music in your life?
Yeah, well, so yeah, I mean, I consider myself an author and who likes to play music, but I have played classical and jazz flute since I was a little boy, and I love it. I love playing flute. Um, Actually, the moment when I got the idea for Rhapsody happened, after my father died, maybe a year or two after he died. I've told this story before, but I was having breakfast. It was early in the morning. I get up very, very early and I work on my writing before dawn. Um, and I was having my coffee, and the CD player was on, and it was set for shuffle. So it's all these, I have 300 CDs in there, and Rhapsody in Blue comes on. And I remember my father, who was a wonderful jazz clarinetist, playing along with that record when I was a little boy, and I broke down in tears. And I just knew that was going to be the centerpiece of my next novel. So I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Yes, no, that's great. I know at one point you talked a little bit about the influence of your father
Yeah.
with
Oh
music.
yeah.
I don't know if you'd like to address that. It was
Oh
very,
yeah. I feel that. I mean, I don't know exactly which interview you're referring to, but um, I do feel that this book was a lot about reaching back to an earlier time in history, which was really my father was born at the end of the period I'm writing about here, but he grew up loving this music. And it was a big part of the Jewish American experience. Jazz, Gershwin in particular, and it was a huge part of my father's life. So yes, I think I was to say that I feel I was reaching out to my father. That's only half the story. I really feel he was reaching back to me, um, and beyond him to some of his idols. And there's this another story I tell, which is true. He was his day job. I mean, he was a jazz clarinetist, as I said, but he went to medical school. He actually earned his way through medical school playing jazz clarinet. Um, And he became an eminent cardiologist at UCLA. And one day, they wheeled Duke Ellington into his office. And for basically, Duke Ellington was dying. He had pneumonia, but they wanted a cardiovascular exam. And my father said to him, "Mr. Ellington, you're one of the great heroes of my life. It's such an honor to meet you." And he performed the exam. And here Duke Ellington is showing up in my book now. So it's like my father got to meet his hero, and I got to meet, you know, my father and his hero in this book.
Great.
But I feel I'm doing that in every book I write. I'm I'm getting to know people whom I need to get to know. Even in this book that I'm writing now, which is set in, as I say, in the 60s and in 2019, I'm reaching out to people that I need to reach out to. Yeah. And they're reaching back. Even though they're people in the 2019 part, these are people who are kind of composites of people I've met in the real world today, but I still want to get to know them better through fiction.
That's great. Well, your characters definitely come alive and transport us to these times. So thank you very
Thanks, Denise.
much.
Thank you.
So speaking of music, I think it's time to share our surprise.
Yeah.
It's very hard to look at a title called Rhapsody and think about George Gershwin without having the music play in our heads. So if you haven't already gone back and listened to the music before the presentation, we have a jazz musician in our midst. And so Mitchell's offered to play a couple songs for us on his flute. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Mitchell.
Okay, so to say I've offered to play a couple songs, it's my honor, and frankly, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be able to play a couple of songs. This has been an excuse for me, this and several other presentations around the country that are coming up. This is the very first, by the way, of several that are coming up around the country. It's been an opportunity for me to make the acquaintance of my flute, of my two flutes once again. The first number that I'm going to play for you is by Gershwin. It's called Embraceable You. And I'm going to play it on the alto flute, which, well, you'll hear it. All right, well, my speaker battery is dying, so I apologize. This is going to come to an end much sooner than we thought, and I'm not going to be able to improvise, I guess. Let me see. I would like to try. I think the sound, can you still hear the speaker? Could you still hear it at the end of that?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to try one other number quickly because this is the song that everyone associates with Gershwin more than any other. And I want to see if we can get through some of it on the concert flute, on the regular flute. So here goes. Let's give it a shot. We'll end at that. All right. Well, it is what it is. Sorry. I didn't have any idea that was going to happen, but I won't explain why it happened. But anyway, that's where we are. We have
Well,
two more
thank you. I mean,
uh,
just having music during this presentation to enhance our senses and to just have that visual picture of Gershwin and all the music that they composed together. It's really, I learned so much from the book. I've had a few comments from the audience about introducing music through the lens of identity. And you really get a sense of the book of the culture clashes and blending. So thank you so much for that. So I think I'll go ahead and close. We'll end a little early here. I wanted to mention that those of you in the Pasadena area, I'm going to hold up a copy of the book. For those of you in the Pasadena area, there are a limited number of signed copies of Mitchell's book that are available at Vroman's bookstores, our official community partner and bookseller of the 2021 Jewish Book Festival. You can also order the book at vromansbookstore.com. Our next event is virtual. It's this Sunday, November 7th at 4 p.m. This event is co-hosted by the University of Laverne, and it's their annual Kristallnacht Memorial event. Our author is Leah Garrett, and this is a nonfiction book called X-Troop, The Secret Jewish Commandos of World War II. We hope to see you there, and thank you all for joining us, and have a great rest of the evening.